If you've seen the show, you don't need me to tell you this, but the first 30 seconds of Cowboy Bebop are wild. Cowboy Bebop is a 1998 anime with the best opening credits of all time, but it's also an intensely interesting study on exposition, because in its 26 episode run, it rarely just tells you something, and this is the most true in the first episode. The first time I watched it, I actually wondered if I'd missed something, but no. The show's just incredibly subtle and smart about how it tells you its story, especially the story that's happening off screen. Okay, so normally here I'd summarize the first episode and then we'd get into it, but in the nature of trying new things, I'm gonna go tell you to watch it, and if you haven't seen it for a while, to go watch it again. I know it's bad practice for me to just tell you to, leave this video and go watch something else, but I don't think that my summary could do this episode justice. So instead, I'm gonna give you a chance to go watch it. Cool? I'm hoping you watched it, because if not, then the rest of this video is going to make very little sense. The first thing this episode does is have, as I mentioned, an absolutely wild cold open. We get shooting, a rose, and a whole bunch of other stuff that isn't addressed in the entire rest of this episode. This is a setup for a payoff that's down the road, but it works because it gets you hooked and now you want answers. It's why YouTube videos with questions in the title, or I did and then insert something you've always wanted to see tried here, works so well. It's because it hooks you early. This video, on the other hand, employed neither of those tactics, if the title that I'm thinking of is the title that I ended up going with. So maybe I'm just sabotaging myself. The point is, this intro hooks you on the main question of the series and then introduces you to its characters. Most of the time, shows introduce their characters to us and then we get the plot hooks, but this does it in reverse. This disrupts the hero's journey in a way and tells us we're not getting a standard hero's journey, because, spoiler alert, a lot of the hero's journeys already happened, but we don't need to know that yet. Another great thing that Cowboy Bebop does is it gives you just the information you need. Usually, we know what our main characters do, and even more frequently, we know less than they do. Take this episode, for example. We see the bar scene, and like 2 scenes later, Jet learns about the bar scene. Jet and Spike make references to people that we don't know. A majority of this episode is over the shoulder of Spike or Jet. The lore we get about the greater world, or in this case the greater galaxy, comes from passing remarks from side characters or from Jet saying the Syndicate. Who are they? It doesn't matter right now. All that matters is there's no beef in this Bell Peppers and Beef because Jet and Spike need money. Sure, we borderline get told we need money because Jet says something very similar to that, but it comes up naturally, and we even get the explanation of the question, well, if you've been bounty hunting so long, why don't you have any money? When Jet explains, hey Spike, here's why we have no money, because you've messed everything up. It shows that these characters have been working together, and how they interact in this episode, we get a semblance of the history between them. Jet is stern with Spike, but in a way that feels like it comes from an old friend. We learn of their history through how they interact. There's no explanation of how they met, because right now, that doesn't matter. And Cowboy Bebop is a show that is focused so much on what is happening right now. All that matters right now is that there's no beef in this Bell Peppers and Beef, so we need to get some money. The show opens in space, so obviously we're in space, but one line always stands out to me whenever I watch this episode. Spike's line, I was born on Mars. This is an example of us knowing less than our main characters, and is one of the only things that we are explicitly told about Spike's character or backstory in this episode. What else do we see Spike do? We see him train, which pays off in the fight scene. He talks to his ship, which shows how much time he spends flying it, which pays off in the scene of him flying in a firefight. And after he complains about the lack of beef, he steals food. Everything we see him do pays off another time. We don't need to be told by some unnamed character, hey, Spike's a good fighter, because we watched him train, and then we watched him fight. It's the very definition of show don't tell. And that's the lesson of the first episode of Cowboy Bebop and a majority of the show when it comes to exposition. Show, don't tell. It seems obvious and it's said a lot, but it's easy to just have your characters say things instead of actually doing them. Which leads into my second to last example, the loop. I love how this episode ends. After losing another bounty, Spike and Jet eat beefless Bell Peppers and Beef and smoke a cigarette. Don't smoke, it's bad for you. But this takes us right back to where we started, showing us how truly beaten down these characters are. There's no line between them saying, oh, we're right back where we started. This is just what they do, and it's all they do. They're not great at bounty hunting, and they always end up right back here with no money, training for the next bounty. It sets up the arcs of these characters, which I won't get into for spoiler reasons, but it also sets up the audience expectations for this show. The show's fairly episodic. More characters show up, sure, but a majority of the time, it's very contained episode to episode, conflict to conflict, that leaves our characters right back where they started. And this is the best example of how this show does its world building, because by showing these characters where they started, the audience assumes that this is how it is every time, and this is why they're the way they are. It perfectly sets up everything that's about to happen in the rest of the show. And then, credits, with a familiar rose to remind you why you got hooked on the show, the cold open, and the tease of a greater story. I love Cowboy Bebop, and I doubt this is the last time I talk about it on this channel, and really this was a shorter video where I just wanted to talk about the first episode. I didn't even mention the music in this video, which some might consider a crime, but what never ceases to amaze me about this show, besides the aforementioned music, is its astounding world building. New characters and places are introduced constantly, but they usually feel understood by the end of their episode. It's legitimately impressive, and a lot more than a lot of episodic shows can say. So go watch the rest of the show, because you'll never know what random episode I'll pick to talk about next. Speaking of, I don't even know what I'm going to talk about next, because the weather is not ideal for what I'm looking to film for the intro to the video.